Hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining this third Urban AI conversation. Actually, my name is Hubert and I'm the founder of Urban AI. So what is Urban AI? Urban AI is a think tank that federates a global community of pioneers in the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. And together we propose ethical modes of governance and sustainable uses of urban artificial intelligence. But Urban AI is also a space for exchange and debates, and this is why we regularly organize these Urban AI conversations during which members of the community can present their latest research, AD, or even contributions. And today, for this Urban AI conversation, we have the great pleasure to have with us Jess and Mirik. So hi Jess, hi Mirik. Jess, you're assistant professor of data science at the University of Virginia, and you're also actually a contributor of Urban AI. Thanks a lot for being with us today. And Mirik, you're the co-founder of Vibe Lab, and actually you're one of the greatest experts in the field of night governance. So thanks also for accepting this invitation. So for this Urban AI conversation, we'll first have a presentation from Mirik, and then a presentation from Jess, and this time it will be more focused on data science and artificial intelligence. As usual, if you have questions in mind, feel free to use the chat or to wait for the Q&A session and directly ask your question. Mirik, Jess, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hubert, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen and get started straight away. I have more or less 15 minutes, so no time to lose. So thank you all for joining this session, and thank you I hope everybody is awake now. So my name is Mirik Milan. I'm based in Amsterdam. I've been a club promoter all of my working life, and I was the night mayor of Amsterdam between 2012 and 2016. My business partner, Lutz Leitzering, is the founder of the Berlin Club Commission and the spokesperson there. And together we consult cities and brands about nightlife policy. There are at the moment more than 65 night mayors around the world, and it's really exciting to see this growing policy field. In this conversation, I will be talking about three things, which the input is coming from these researches that we have done recently. When we are researching the urban night, and also when in my role as a night mayor, we really understood that there's always three core elements that are vitally important for creating cultural vibrancy, or as we say the cultural relevant nightlife. It's always about the creative community and influential group. It's really much about creative space. This can be, of course, in the digital domain or in the physical space with music venues and cultural places. But it's also very much about the policy framework. And through my work as night mayor of Amsterdam, I really start to understand how this policy can affect the city at night. So first of all, I want to kick off with the policy framework that really empowers and builds capacity. Cultural vibrant nightlife really develops talent. Think about all the photographers, filmmakers, DJs, VJs, live musicians, people that just go out there and perform at night and really develop their talents. It's also my personal story, how I developed my talents as a producer, in the end ending up in the daytime creative industry. We always like to say, and this is something I've learned from the mayor of Amsterdam, is no is the first step to yes. The first reaction of city's officials or people is really often when there's something happens at night, the first reaction is to say, well, we have to stop this now, instead of bringing all the stakeholders together and trying to find a solution that actually works and that can benefit the people that can benefit the people or increase the quality of life. But really what we have learned is that we need to treat people with facts instead of emotions. Many decisions in nightlife are often based, or nightlife policy, or when we're governing the night, are really much based on emotions of a small group of people that are influencing City Hall and city councillors, because they have access to these councillors directly or access to the media. And these night mayors, which has become a global trend over the last 7 to 8 years, they're real translators. And from the paper we published, which I'm a co-author of together with André Nacelas, in urban studies, we really understood that these night mayors around the world, they are translators, they are mediators between either city agencies or between the nighttime operators and city resident groups. But what is interesting to mention is that if the night mayor's position is situated inside city government, so part of city government, or outside city government, so how it was organized in Amsterdam and Berlin, they're all advocates. None of the night mayors around the world, if you look at Berlin or Paris or any other city around the world, they don't have the power to change policies or licensing for music venues on their own. So these are the fields that many night mayors are focusing on, coming out of our research, and you could really take a slice of any of these sections and of the day and add it to the night, and that's what these night mayors are looking for. So it's very much about health and prevention. It's about, of course, also sustainability, policies and laws, but also about diversity, inclusion, and equity. The night mayors really try to bridge the gap between government, nightlife operators, but also city residents. And by creating mutual understanding, many night mayors change the rules of the game. So some conclusions in this end. The nightlife community needs to speak in a unified voice. This is really what we did when I set up the Night Mayor Foundation in Amsterdam. It's really to speak in a unified voice with City Hall, so that people understand what the needs of the nightlife scene are. These night mayors are advocates, as I just mentioned, but also that city officials, you really need to speak the same language to create this mutual understanding, because otherwise we will just run into the same roadblocks we always have. We need to serve people with facts instead of emotions, what I just mentioned, but it's also about empowering change makers. What area in the city can we designate for example, 24-hour use, and how can we start pilot programs, how we did in Amsterdam with the 24-hour licenses, for example. When it comes to the creative community, and these are some insights that we have gathered over the recent months through a research project we have done, which is called Voices of Creators. The Voices of Creators was a research project that was looking into the needs of people working in the creative industries, in music, fashion, and design. And many of the responses were around the space they're using, the community and the access, the training, but also funding they need to develop their creative talent. We have seen in the tech space that there's the importance of digital technologies accelerated a lot for these communities, and it's really important to have access to equal market spaces, and that's a fundamental thing for creative communities to thrive. And that's also why I think for many people in the creative space and the nightly creative industry, the metaverse is something they're really looking into. Many people in nightlife, I can tell you this from a personal story, are very annoyed by the fact that you first invest a lot, you create a lot of content, you build up your fan base, either on social media like Facebook or Twitter or somewhere else, and then you have to pay to reach your own fans. So that's something why equal market spaces are very important for people to to run their business basically. But they also need what's also important, that they need access to software and hardware. Think about editors that want to have the software packages or other understanding, and but also digital technologies, but also definitely business practices. When it comes to equity and inclusion, creatives need funding, training, and access, and definitely access to foreign markets, but also legitimacy in their home communities. And it's very important for these people also to get access because really often being a creative is not something. That's why I'm grabbing the global perspective here. It's really often that being a creative is something that is only possible for people with a wealthy upbringing or in higher education. And there's many parts of the world where this is not the case. And there's also many countries in the world where you would say, oh, I want to be a maker, I want to be a creative. That also sometimes means, okay, so you want to be poor. I've put down here an example of the Potter Academy, which is a great example of how people are used. I'm just gonna, okay. I will share some links afterwards to these examples that I'm showing here. When it comes to co-creation is an essential part of innovations in subcultures. And when the line blur between makers and participants, it really becomes something spectacular. And you see that in many places. But it also makes sure that we are making place for everyone, and to really attract and sustain diversity, to encourage exploration and cross-cultural collaboration. Sexyland is an amazing example of a nightclub in Amsterdam where every night there's a different owner. So there's 365 owners that basically are part of this. Well, I'm an owner as well, but I pay only like, I don't know, 65 euros a year. And then I have a fully fledged music venue with all the assets and all the installations ready for me to organize an event, a party, or a cultural happening. When it comes to conclusions of the nightly creative communities, you really see that microfunding and trading are key in development of the creative communities and to create access and equity. A great example from Berlin, for example, is the music board, where people can get funds between 2,000 and 5,000 euros to maybe master your first album, or to organize your first party, or to get business training to set up your music label, or to start your music company. But also when you look at how the world is rapidly accelerates, people still need to have a sense of belonging and also to be engaged. And therefore, I think it's very important that we also be looking at definitely at the metaverse. How does the metaverse integrate into our lives? But also, how can it be used to promote a city around the world, or to promote a nightlife community around the world? We really believe that co-creation can give a place soul, and it's real these connections that are the real currency, not the transactions or the financial transactions. When I go to creative space, and I think this is the one that relates the most to the conversation today. Over the course of the last years, we have developed a methodology called the creative footprint. And the creative footprint is a methodology that is basically it's a nightlife impact study, and we benchmark nighttime governance structure, but we also map and index creative space to understand what the impact of these spaces are on the creative community or on the city. And the creative footprint idea is quite simple behind it. What you often see in cities is that the nighttime communities help to develop city areas, often in the outskirts of a city, or as you have seen also in the 80s and 90s, when formal industrial areas were developed by nighttime communities. That when there's a lot of creative space in the city, that city will also be attractive for the creative community. And the creative community being such a driver for urban economic growth, that's why it's important for cities to think about how do we attract and invite these creatives into our cities. But also on the other hand, if these music venues get closed down again, how do you make sure that your creative footprint stays in balance, and that you need to have the policy in place to open up these venues somewhere else. As I just shown, the creative footprint, we have done it now in 4 cities. Stockholm will be released in a couple of weeks time, and I think we research now and gather data of more than 4,000 music venues in these 4 cities, and that data is very important to arm the creative community and to arm night mayors with data that will help to protect these spaces on the long term. So our methodology goes beyond the economic impact, and really looking at original content and interdisciplinary connections. We really believe that if a venue has a multidisciplinary use, is maybe used 24/7, that really strengthens the function and strengthens the position of this place in a neighborhood or in somewhere else. The goal of CFP is really to show the value of these spaces that foster talent, but also strengthen communities and make cities unique. So here I just pulled out some of the insights from the creative footprint in New York, and which was interesting to see. Something that we might know, but it was never proven in any way, is that when you look at Manhattan, for example, in Manhattan, the content is less experimental. It's often more commercial, also because the rents in Manhattan are, of course, much higher than in the rest of the world, rest of the city, or in other places of the city. And you saw this movement going. You saw this movement going east, where more and more experimental and more progressive and innovative spaces were moving into the direction where the rents are lower. But that's why it's so important to have these spaces, and that's why we also need to protect them, because of course nightlife can be an accelerator for gentrification, but I think it's also the city that needs to decide, hey, these are the people, or these are the spaces we want to have in our inner city, and thinking about what is the long-term investment. How do we keep a neighborhood or an area vibrant so that we don't end up with monoculture? Here are some global trends that we've pulled out to give you a bit of a global view of what's happening when it comes to space and creative spaces. So in New Delhi in India, in New Delhi and in Mumbai, but in many cities in India, there's this concept called antisocial. It's a daytime co-working space, it's nighttime, evening and cocktail bar, and also a late night club. They really were operating around the clock, and it's this multifunctional use of the space really makes it an interesting and vibrant place to go. What you see in Europe is that purpose-driven creative places and spaces really disrupt and educate, but empower also the youth of tomorrow. I just want to pull out one example of Bora, which is in the end, it's a textile company, but it's also a fashion brand. And they really have created an accessible tool and a platform for creators to develop their own clothing, to have sustainable fashion, because the biggest problem for fashion designers is finding the right textile, finding the textile that has a certain quality so that they can produce on a high level. And they recently won a huge design prize in the Netherlands for opening up this market and really disrupting. And for the last one, I think it's really interesting to show that the recent real estate price swings that happened in the US also has led to temporary use of spaces. Many people would say, well, probably after the pandemic, there will be a lot of spaces lost in, for example, in New York, or places where there was really the real estate prices were really high. But I think we can say that definitely, for example, in New York, there were a lot of new music venues opened up in the last year, the last 6 months. So that is also a different way. So how do we can go from temporary use to permanent? That's always what we hope to try for. And you've seen a growth of these more immersive experiences that also drive tourism. And I think a really great example is, of course, the Mayo Wolf experience that started in Santa Fe. That's also the reason why I know what Santa Fe is. And they really foster like a really a big community of creatives and really drive tourism also. So coming back to this and following up with some conclusions, the use of space 24/7 is a really way to innovate and disrupt. making the space accessible and affordable for people to experiment. And I think that's very important. That's also something we have done in Amsterdam in the past, but also you see this also happening in many other places. But we also need to think about how can we make sure that the creative community is also really part of the decision-making process. Can we create a lived code of conduct that changes, and also in which we exchange and how to basically to make sure that the space is used in the right way, that the city also realizes that the value that these creators bring to the city, and how they shape the identity of our cities. So just coming back to the first, so as I went through the creative community, the creative space, and the policy framework, these are all sections that the creative and nightly creative industry is connected to. So I want to leave it at this for now. I hope it didn't went too quick and stayed within time. Thank you so much, and I will share a few links of the projects I described just now in the chat. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and I will hand over to Jess now to continue.
Thanks, Mirik. Thanks, Hubert. Merci. Okay, hope you can see this properly. Okay, so yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for having me. So just so you know where I'm coming from, today I'm here representing two organizations, the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, where I'm an assistant professor, and we've been working in this emerging field of responsible data science. There are several ways to approach this. I'll get to it in a minute. And also as a member of the Night Council from Montreal, Svankat. We are 12 members. I'm one of them. We are the first Night Council in Montreal, Canada. And our mandates were started in 2020 during the pandemic, funny enough, and this year, so it's a 2-year mandate. We've been working closely with the city. And today, I'll briefly cover two experiences. One is this approach to responsible data science and things we've been starting to do here in terms of like this overlapping agenda of nightlife governance and data/AI/smartness, and how we are approaching this, and tell you a little bit about the things and our experience in advocacy and research with nightlife governance in its ecosystem in Montreal. So here, the main point for us, like I've been working with this kind of like smart cities and AI and data research and policy agenda for a while, mostly in Latin America, Canada, and now in the United States. So looking for ways to approach this responsibly and taking into account transparency, accountability, fairness, and all these big words that are this kind of like receiving lots of attention. It's very important to us to approach this responsibly. Of all these data-centric initiatives deployed in urban space, and of course, thinking about data science and AI in this case to encompass this broader social framework. So we prioritize ethics, but also go beyond ethics a little bit. So we are also thinking about digital rights and public policy and governance models. And of course, addressing these challenges and opportunities of this policy and research agenda for the 24-hour city. So how does this overlap? Even though we have like so many studies about smart cities, for example, and AI in urban spaces, and night studies is this field that is already consolidated for almost 20 years now. These two agendas do not overlap that much, and they definitely should. And so I want to quickly talk about two main areas of interest in this overlap of nightlife and AI/data here. One, of course, is open data and ways to measure and understand the cities. It's crucial for us to have access. And it seems like something that it's already established. Sometimes it is, depends a lot on the city, the policies in place locally. But sometimes it's just like constant work trying to get access to open data sets so we can measure and understand night for example. And this is something that I see has been an ongoing discussion in night studies as well, both academically, but also in the municipal level with all the advocacy organizations, grassroots movements and communities. We want to understand, and I think this became even more clear during the pandemic, and because we could not understand exactly the impacts of the pandemic on nightlife and its entire ecosystem. So this is like one of the main points here that I see this agenda overlapping, and also data-centric technologies, which is like a fancy way to talk about like all this technologies and systems using data, like big data. And then we can mention like the most popular ones like facial recognition technologies, sensors, and even platform labor. And these things have also a lot to do with night, even if at first we don't think so, but like deployment of facial recognition technologies for surveillance and security reasons. But also we've seen some festivals and spaces trying to implement facial recognition so people can, for example, access venues, and how this can be problematic, and I'll get to it in a minute. So there's lots of potential, but also several problems that you need to be aware of. And here, like really precarious, kind of like nightlife as an ecosystem, as we address it here. It's really small, but just so you have an idea, nightlife, sometimes I think about like very specific parts of it, but here we are trying to understand it as like an entire ecosystem within the city, from like healthcare workers and hospitals around 24 hours to the media and radio shows that also are working overnight. And then you have transit and mobility, noise and noise governance, public lighting, sustainability, public order and public safety, unhoused communities inhabiting the city at night that also are like a matter of governance and community engagement, all sorts of regulation, entertainment, creativity, and all like these areas that Mirik mentioned as well. So trying to think of night as this entire ecosystem, and then we can see more clearly how open data and data-centric technologies would overlap here. So there's all these things. And to think about challenges, for example, we try to approach the night as a space of cohabitation, and it's not binary, it's not like formal and informal. We do have formal and informal activities, legal and illegal, even though I don't like these words very much, all these gray areas, noise and silence. So night is a space of negotiation as well. And we don't want the deployment of certain technologies to tackle informal parties, for example, or creative spaces that are not necessarily regulated or too formal. So we need to protect and make sure that deploying this technology will not harm communities, and I'll get to this in a minute. And also it will not exacerbate historical inequalities. And there are so many studies right now looking at facial recognition, how it can exacerbate racial discrimination. It targets people, all the case of inaccuracy. So we need to be very careful if we plan to use these things. And for example, Canada right now in the House of Commons are discussing a potential ban to facial recognition security altogether. And I know Brazil is doing this debate right now as well. So like, just be careful the technologies we bring to the urban night as well, like be very critical towards it. Think about all these regulatory frameworks for data and open data, but also these technologies and the potential impacts they have because they seem like very shiny and nice sometimes, but just like be aware of the challenges. Also a matter of visibility, especially if we talk about open data. For example, doing public consultations and working with communities in Montreal, we saw that not everybody wants to be visible. A clear example is the unhoused communities during curfew in Montreal, and how like releasing their data, like location and names, that it's really harmful to the community. And also if you talk about transgender, gender non-conforming, queer communities, they not necessarily want to be visible. And when we're doing a study trying to track and put on a map the informal nights of the city, we also did not give the city government and the police the exact location of certain parties in creative space because they are not properly regulated, let's say, would fall under informal or illegal. And we don't not want to like harm these communities. And we do want this space to exist because we know nightlife thrives in the cracks and these gray areas as well. So just like being very careful about these issues of visibility and visibility in data sets as well. Like we do want open data, but just like be careful about like these issues of visibility. And there is no one size fits all solution at all. We do not believe like in top-down policies and like this kind of work with communities and everything. And of course, there are also several opportunities. I do believe and try to foster open data policies for sure. They help us, as I said, to understand the city and our communities. And it's important to like researchers and grassroots organizations, civil society. So it's like very important to have this there. It also helps us to offer better services, accuracy, resource allocations in terms of municipal government as well. And hopefully we can start to discuss more serious climate justice in how it is connected to this kind of like smartness/AI agenda in the city. We just like started to think about this project here with Will, who is here, and Alejandro from Mexico, trying to create this Observatory of Urban Data for the night in North America, very exploratory. We're just starting to think about these things, and that's something that the school is supporting us as much as possible to kind of like map and track open data sets, these smart initiatives, and try to make this a platform that is a resource, like offers free and open licensed resources to everyone who is interested, and also trying to consolidate like a multi-stakeholder network of partners. So if you're ever interested in contributing, let us know, because it's just starting and we want to move with this in this kind of like post-pandemic recovery, if we can talk about that already. And to give you like more pragmatic example about things we've been working in Montreal, as you know, in Quebec, Canada, around 4 million people in the metropolitan regions. It's kind of a big city, and it is known as an AI hub. Le Monde called it the new Silicon Valley in 2019 for the AI hub in the city, and all the huge public funding and the investments in the city to develop this kind of like smartness agenda and an AI agenda. So they are thinking about this. They do have a social data hub called Montreal en Commun, and they've been discussing, they even put up a public consultation process for the digital data charter in 2020 that we had the chance to participate as well and try to like help shape the principles in this debate from this kind of like responsible approach. And it is a city that like, for over a century has been known for its vibrant nightlife, amazing cultural life, and this create spaces for creativity that are not necessarily, let's say, mainstream or too regulated. And we wrote a little bit about this. This is organized by Mirik and the Vibe Lab. So we did, Will, Mathieu, and myself, we wrote like a short case study about how Montreal was shaping a nighttime policy during the pandemic, which was quite an experience for all of us as a conseil, but also as researchers. And so Montreal is a city that we can see the overlap of these two agendas clearly, because they are thinking about data governance and they also think about nightlife governance. So the Night Council was established in 2020. And since then, we contributed to the local nightlife policy. They appointed the equivalent of a night mayor, as Mirik mentioned, and he was, we have Deborah Delaney as the commissioner of night and noise in English. She acts as this equivalent of a night mayor, and she put together this collaborative process to help develop a new nightlife policy in 2020. We still don't have the final draft. We had elections and the pandemic, and it's been like ups and downs. But the process of getting specialists, civil society organization, creative people, all together, the police and so many other departments in the city together to collaborate and try to draft a very comprehensive nightlife policy was quite interesting. And open data and this kind of like technology deployment was a part of it, a small one, but it was there as well. And then we decided, talking to Deborah, was trying to like get together a data inventory for the night in the city, and you can understand my frustration when I received a one-page PDF document with some links. So if you work with open data, you know like how frustrating this is, and some departments in the city just refuse to share any sort of data with us, especially the police. So yeah, and then there were like some problematic things about geolocalized information from housed people. That's a problem as well. So this is like how far we went at the time. So this is like a constant thing and ongoing conversations. We try to get more information from the public engines that manages the public transit system in the city, try to talk to the police, and we've been like having these conversations with the municipal government over the years. So it takes like a lot of time, a lot of patience, and this kind of engagement with different communities, trying to do this in a like nice way. And here, like some of the campaigns we had like the summits, also like campaigns during the pandemic to try to not let nightlife be left aside. And also like we had public consultation, which was a great experience to hear like from artists, residents, queer communities, racialized communities, and their perception, their lived experience of the night. And this issue of like technology and data came up here and there. And when we wrote the policy recommendations, I'll share the links with all of you. Once this is done, it's in French. We have like all the reports are easily accessible and free to download, but they are in French. And we did write policy recommendations because the city government commissioned this to us. So after talking to the citizens and conducting all these public consultations and studies that have like so many people involved, we could have like a better idea of nightlife and the perceptions and demands of people here. And so, you know, like this is still like an ongoing process. I don't think like it's like a collective effort that we're trying to do, like interview people, map those surveys, and trying to understand also like how people would like their data to be managed, like where we lack, like talking to all the business owners and people inhabiting the night, you know, like what kind of data do you need? What kind of technology here, data-centric initiatives would be helpful? How, if we do this irresponsibly, how would that harm your communities and the perceptions that people have over there in terms of like the deployment of these initiatives as well? In Canada, it's like we do have good open data policies, but it's still like quite precarious, like quick search in open data portals. You see some things related to the night, but it's not systematically organized, and we want to change this. So hopefully having like a platform, also kind of observatory would be easier for people who are willing or they want to look for information about nightlife to just go there and look. And we've mapped over 200 organizations in the city and divided that into 4 categories. And next month, no, in May, we have the next upcoming Sommet de la Nuit, our new night summit. And so things are moving slowly. The pandemic impacted the work a lot. So I think like this is like a larger conversation that we should have all together as nightlife governance folks, people working with the night. And if you have like any ideas and want to get in touch with us, you're more than welcome to reach out. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mirik and Jess, for these very interesting and insightful presentations. Both were very complimentary. It was really great. If you have questions, you can use the chat or raise your hands. And actually, I have a question. Well, actually, I have several questions. But Jess, you said, and it's really a very interesting idea that not everybody wants to be visible. How could we have this right in a digital and data-driven world? I mean, how could we make it still possible? Because I agree that not everybody wants to be visible, and even all of us, we don't want to be always visible, and sometimes night can be the right time not to be visible, but it appears that it's less and less the case, and that we are more and more visible, more naked in a way. So how could we still have this kind of invisibility?
Thanks, Mirik. That's a great question. I'm a regulation nerd, so sorry if this is like too regulatory, but there are several ways. We are talking about consent as well, informed consent, like being able to opt in or out. And I think like the European Union has one of like what's considered the best general data protection regulation, with its flaws for sure, but it's still like trying to protect from a public interest perspective of data protection and privacy and digital rights, but some other places do not. And so it depends a lot on where we are talking about, because doing this in Montreal is different from Rio or Mexico or Barcelona, for example. So it depends a lot on like regulations in place. And if people should have an option to not be surveilled if that technology is going to be harmful. That's why I think like sometimes I see some festivals trying to implement facial recognition technologies that might be of concern, because you might have people who are undocumented, let's say, with like not a regular status in the country. That was something that emerged during our conversations. You might have people being misidentified, like wrongfully arrested. There are plenty of cases of FRT technology providing wrong information for arrest. So just like be very careful about like what kind of technologies we want to use in nightlife, because this idea of visible and invisible depends on a lot of other things. And that's one of the things that I talk to my students constantly here. Like sometimes we have this amazing solution for a problem, but we really need to think about the impacts. And the question we need to ask is always like, what can go wrong? And are we really like protecting our communities with this, or people will be uncomfortable? So have the option of opting out, for example. That's one way of like not being visible. And whenever from the policy level, whenever designing policy, like policy making, the municipal level, keeping in mind that some people might not be, or the way they are visible does not necessarily reflect who they are, if you're talking about gender identities and expressions, for example. So data sets can be flawed and they do not necessarily represent the reality. So just like making all the nuances in the situation, when we bring this to nightlife, having in mind that like many of the activities are not necessarily legal, even though I don't like this expression, and we want them to be that way, you know, like look at the history of raves and parties and how important this is to so many communities, and all the DIY, like do-it-yourself queer spaces in Montreal, they're very important to the community. And if we would like regulate, surveil, then that could like end or move them to even like more dangerous space as they put themselves. So I hope this answers.
Yeah, I would also like to jump in there quickly. So no, I think it's also for us in the creative footprint study where we're gathering so much data about spaces. And I think that Jess mentioned it in the right way. It's not, it's really often that spaces are illegalized, you know, because there is not a place where you can do it, or where you can do it in an affordable way. So we are always very careful that we don't want to expose people when we're gathering data. You don't want to give, for example, you know, you would always name a neighborhood where something is taking place, instead of saying, well, on this block, on this specific house number, between these two warehouses, there's an exciting things happening. So yeah, it's and you know, so that is like when you look at data sets, if you look at people going out at night, you know, more on the personal level, there's also a huge trend when there's even many clubs where you're not allowed to use your phone inside, not for taking pictures, but also not for communicating. So that has definitely on the Europe mainland has been a big trend.
Thanks a lot for your answer. Albert, I guess you wanted to add something on this question.
Yes, when Jess was explaining about what you can do in technology under GDPR, some 8 years ago we had a challenge from one of the mayors.
Albert, sorry, just could you quickly introduce yourself like this?
Oh, sorry.
Everyone
No,
knows
we know each other, so this is why I'm start talking.
Yeah.
Sorry. So apologies for that. No, I'm leading our smart cities portfolio and strategy in Atos for the last decades globally. So that's in a nutshell who I am. But I'm leading our strategic challenges that we face with cities. And you might recognize Eindhoven in this. When the mayor addressed us, because the city was suffering from too much safety incidents. It was 9 years ago, 8-9 years ago. So the economy wasn't that good. People were out there with less money. Pub owners couldn't survive basically. So the mayor didn't want to close pubs because of any irregularities, but he wanted to have a more, I would say, constant supervision of what was happening. So what we did, we did not put up more cameras. I'm a former police officer, so putting up cameras is not helping you, and putting up more uniforms on the street is either not helping you. But what we did is we turned the footage into red dots. So the only thing we saw, as a privacy by design approach, were red dots. That allowed us much easier to analyze the movement patterns of people in the street. Are they running? Are they doing silly dances? What's happening in the street? Because a silly dance could also be a bar fight. So this is how you understand. You can easily count the number of people going in, going out. So you can set thresholds. For the German market, that's very important. And then we combined it with analytics of sound, so not decibels. We're not interested in gunshots, but we were interested in the sentiment, so the megahertz analytics. We all did it in the edge, so we did not store any data we didn't need. We could only pinpoint suspicious movement patterns combined with suspicious sound patterns, like aggressive people in a city dance, and then send out a notification to any officer on the street. So, well, we did not judge, just something is happening on this location, you better go there before something escalates. The result was there was 50% less police people needed for a Friday or a Saturday evening. 80% reduction of incidents, because they had in 800 opening hours of pubs, 1,600 incidents every year. So twice an hour, meaning people had to be treated on the street or brought to hospital. It reduced heavily because people were warned at entrance of the area, your movements are recorded, your sound is recorded, is analyzed. So there was a good, people understood. And the bar owners in the end paid for it because they were feeling that they were helped by this initiative from the city. And then we started the city lab collaboration so we can better identify what's happening, where it is. I'm not saying it's the ideal solution, but at least in a privacy by design approach, you can do different with the technology that's most common at the moment, and that's still a camera. I'm not a big fan of cameras. You can understand that from my saying here, but even though I was responsible as an officer to put up the first surveillance camera in the Netherlands ever, so it's okay. But just my contribution here to that. Sorry.
No, I think that's interesting because when we are talking about safety, and especially during the night, we often have in mind surveillance, and sometimes safe city means surveillance city. And it's really interesting to see how we could create safety without surveillance, and that's not easy actually to do. Jess or Mirik, do you want to react on what said Albert?
Sure. Thanks, Albert. That's good. That's why I value working with local departments and communities so much, because everyone has a different perception and experience. And sometimes they're like more like theoretical policy level, and we need this kind of like everyday real life examples. So I value that. If for your question, Hubert, for example, the perceptions of safety. When we inquired women in Montreal, like cis women, they told us, yeah, we feel very safe. Montreal is a fairly safe city. But when we were talking to other residents, and especially queer people and people of color in the city, they said like, we don't feel safe here at all at night. This is like perception of safety in the night. So it depends a lot on like who you are, where you come from, the color of your skin, and your gender identity or sexuality. These things will shape like your sense of safety. And for example, like the Montreal police force is known for like having many issues. And the city even created a specific department to deal with systemic racism in the city, which is like quite a good new approach. And they work with like nightlife issues as well. So it depends a lot on who you are. And of course, you have to keep this in mind. So they don't feel safe having the police around while other people do. And surveillance might work for some people, but not work for other people. So just like finding balance and trying to tackle other systemic issues. I know like this is such a vague response, but working together, strong communities, I really believe like strong communities do not need like this level of surveillance and can be safe in other ways, because this idea of safety is always I don't know, nuanced, to say the least.
I have another question actually, because I was wondering, like, Jess and Mirik, do we have some data that are only available by during the night? I don't know if you see what I mean. For example, it could be some animals that we can only see the night because they are going to go out the night and not during the day. So do we have this kind of data that tell us a different story about the city?
Well, the only data I can think of is maybe the reports of nuisance and complaints. You will have them also. No, there's not like a very clear point, but I think if you look at things that are definitely and increasing, that could be one to look at.
Yes, wildlife. I'm sorry. Yeah, wildlife data for sure. Nocturnal animals. If we go like beyond a little bit, like just even in the urban environment, like wildlife data, but also noise complaints and this kind of other complaints, as Mirik said, and also things that operate overnight. Like you can have like transit system information for the night, like after dark. And you're the second person to ask me that, and I've been thinking about this, what sort of data we only collect at night. But yes, all the activities happening at night, like cultural activities, places that open quite late and then open overnight if the city allows you to have like quite late closing times. But yeah, that's a very good question I've been thinking about. I don't have a good answer either, sorry.
Also, maybe a question for you this time, Mirik, and also, of course, Jess, feel free to answer if you have insight. At the beginning of your presentation, you talk about the kind of relationship between like creativity and nightlife. And do we have like some, I would say, data-driven evidences on this? Because this is really an interesting topic, maybe, you know, to be able to evaluate the creativity of a city depending of its nightlife. This is something that we could do, for example.
I think in a way that's what we are hoping to achieve with the creative footprint, of course. I think for us it's very important that we the problem, what I see when it comes to, let's say, nighttime economy or night culture or nightlife is the night is very stigmatized, you know, so it's always like the first impression, or when you say nightlife, the first thing people think of is, well, in Amsterdam, for example, is drunken English tourists puking on the street and nuisance of some sort. But there's also a very large part of the nightlife that, you know, that drives economic development. If you look at, for example, the electronic music industry in the Netherlands, well, before the pandemic, of course, but that's a market that is close to 1 billion euros of economic impact on a yearly basis and has around about 15,000 people working in that industry. And therefore, we always try to, but the problem is that, and you saw that, I think the pandemic was a really clear example, how you see that the night is still very much demonized, is that if 1 billion euros of economic impact in any other industry that people can more easily relate to would like evaporate, then it would be a much bigger conversation. When we had a public hearing in the parliament, there was like, I don't know, 1 or 2 politicians that showed up. So that means that it's also very difficult for many politicians to really stand up for nightlife and say, well, this is an industry I want to be known for, and this is an industry that I think is important. So that's why we, with the creative footprint, but also with another project that we are doing, where we're looking at the SCG. So how can we connect the values that are being created in nightlife? How can we connect that to another measurement system, so that we, of course, using the economic data, but we know that the economic data, which is used for so many, well, to push forward so many big decisions, doesn't really serve us, because as I just explained, politicians don't want to stand up to it, and and the night is demonized. So that's why we were looking at, for example, the SCGs, and we saw that out of the 17 SCGs, 9 of them very much reflect what is happening in this cultural relevant nightlife space when it comes to strengthening infrastructures, when it comes to, of course, sustainable energy use, but also sustainable resources use, when it comes to gender equality. You know, so there's many topics in the SDGs that are actually like, when you would look at what nightlife communities are doing, building communities, bringing people together, creating social cohesion, you know, developing talents in an informal setting. That is very much part of what the UN thinks is the way forward to strengthening cities, or strengthening people's lives, and increasing the quality of life for people around the world.
Okay, thanks. We have a question also in the chat from Ramon. Ramon from Placemaking Europe, who is asking if there are examples of places where there is a collective agreement to monitor data for the sake of safety, but where the data would be collectively managed and protected. I guess that's a very good question, not easy to answer.
Want to go ahead first, Mirik?
No, you go ahead. Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. So sorry, go on.
Okay. No, that's a good question. Thanks, Ron. Not at a large scale, I would say. Maybe two things here. Not at a large scale, but I don't doubt that small community spaces are trying to implement something like this. But for the large scale examples, we do have like some really bad examples. Unfortunately, even like this industry-led policymaking and how they're influencing lawmaking also at the municipal levels in terms of like surveillance and CCTV and facial recognition technologies. But I do have hope that this is changing. For example, people are talking way more about data stewardship and collective ways to protect and manage data, even like data collection, from data collection to data management and analysis, for example. And I believe the emergence of other frameworks to deal with data, like the indigenous AI protocols, care principles, and these other non-Western views of data and how we collectively collect and manage data. I hope like there's some hope that things might change. And I believe it's easier to do this in a local, small scale than largely like country-wise, federal level. So yeah, I do have hope that we will start to see in like several community spaces are thinking about this, not surveilling at all. If they do have to surveil, how they can protect data and people and their peers, for example.
I was wondering, Jess, on this question, would you say that we don't have the good technology, that we don't have the good governance framework, or do you see what I mean? For example, do we need another kind of blockchain, or I don't know, a new technology that would help to collectively manage data, or do we need a new political or governance framework?
We'll probably be disappointed. I mean, no, we don't need more technology. Technology won't save us.
Yeah, I know.
We do have enough. And I believe like it's a matter of planning, deploying, evaluating, and creating mechanisms from regulatory and policy perspective, but bottom up, working with people in their communities, knowing their needs. And that's something that we are like trying to do and understand like what kind of data do you guys need? How can we make this happen in a way that will not harm you or will not harm you that much? So I think like in terms of technology, we're doing okay. We do have like so much data. And it's this kind of like discussion with my students constantly, because they are on the other side, the technical side of things. And it's just like, okay, we do have these skills in the technology. So now how can we make this work for everybody in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example? So might be a little disappointing, but I think we do have the technology. We need like mechanisms and collective community engagement, for example.
That's interesting because, as you said, this is not a technical issue. This is a political one and a social one. Last question, and it will be for you, Mirik. So from Kao, I hope I said your name well. You mentioned that India is making good use of space for multifunction users that are different for daytime and night. This is interesting. Could you share more details on this? How do they achieve this? What is the motivation? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think because the cities are so condensed and there are so many people living in the same place, that they're also thinking about, of course, what can we do? How can we make use of the space 24/7? Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking about. So can I, if I would share a little bit more details? No, I think what's interesting, for example, a project that we did in Amsterdam, to go a little bit more into detail. Of course, the motivations are also economic. I think that's really often also with sustainability. You know, if you look at the nighttime space or music festivals, you know, sustainability also, or becoming more sustainable is also because these organizations, they want to do it financially more sustainable. So thinking about how to minimize power use, how to use plastic, not using plastic cups, but reusable cups. So there's also an economic aspect to this as well. But what is maybe interesting to share in a brief moment is a project we did in Amsterdam where we introduced 24-hour licenses. We didn't have venues that could go all night. But what's radical about this approach was that for the first time we looked at the creative content these venues were producing. So not just, you know, do you have four walls, a roof, and a bouncer in front of the door, but what is the actual content you are producing? And that's very difficult for cities to take on these roles, because then you're more or less curating who you want to have, what kind of venues do you want to have in the city. But I think it's a really good way to make sure that these venues, like a little like city within a city, aspect. So many of these places were multifunctional. They had a bar, gallery, co-working space. Some of them even had a daycare facility for children. And then you're using the space more efficiently also during the week, because many music venues and nightclubs, they're open from Friday to Sunday, and the rest of the week it's a big black door in your neighborhood and nothing really happens there. So if we can make it more into a 24-hour use, a more community space, a place where multiple activities are happening, and we're also stimulating. So with this approach in Amsterdam, we were really stimulating venue operators to think differently on how to program their venue. And for example, in the first round of licenses that were given out, we had 10 licenses. I was working closely with our former mayor, Eberhard van der Laan, who unfortunately passed away. But we had 10 licenses we could give out. The first proposals we got, we didn't felt that the right proposals were there, so we only gave out 4, and we said to everyone, well, you have to try again, because we really want to do something differently here. How can these spaces really have a positive impact? How can we have how does it impact the cultural relevance of Amsterdam in the nighttime space, but also how can it be beneficial for the people living around these spaces as well?
Thanks. That's really a very interesting point, because when you give the possibility to people to differently use the space, you also empower them, give them more power, and so that's really super interesting. Sometimes this is what we have called, chronotopia. So this is really interesting. Well, this is already. Sorry for this. This is already the end of this Urban AI conversation. Thanks a lot, Jess and Mirik, for taking the time to answer the questions, for the very insightful and fascinating presentation. Night governance is definitely a fascinating topic. Thanks to all of you for attending this session and for your questions. The recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel very soon. An article about this topic will also be available on our blog next week. And we will have our last urban AI conversation. Yes, this is already be our last urban AI conversation next week, and it will be about air pollution. Thanks, everyone. Have a very good day. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.